Let's go ahead and create this slider assembly and add motion. So to get started, we want to create a new assembly. And then we're going to drag parts from our class files assembly beam engine folder. So we'll come out to Solid Edge, come to New Assembly, then come over to Parts Library. And which part should I start with? Connector, crank, crank to rocker, rocker, slider, slider base. Now remember we talked about this. The first part we drag in is grounded, and so we want the big bulky base part first. So we're going to drag in slider base, and then we'll come back and let's drag in the slider. And you could do this in different order. It just makes more sense for me to do it like this. So I'm going to drag in the slider, and I'm going to pick that back face. I'm going to hesitate because I don't want to rotate. And I'll right mouse click when the options come up and say I want that back plane. And I want to mate that to this face. Then I'll come in and grab this edge and lock it to this face behind this one. Again, hesitate, wait, and there's the one that I want. I'm just going to move that down into a more logical position, somewhere where it would start down here, and hit escape. Back to my parts library, and look at the other parts I could bring in. Let's bring in the rocker. So I'll drag in the rocker, and I'll get this back face, hesitate, grab that plane, and lock to this front face here. Then I'll come up to the cylinder and lock to this cylinder. Back to my parts library. Let's look at the other parts. Let's take the crank now. So I'll drag the crank in, back face again, right mouse click to get the back face. I'd like to put that on this face. And I'll come down to the axis and lock to this cylinder axis. Now come back to my parts library, and now I'm going to grab the crank to rocker. Let's just drag that down here. Hesitate, get the back face. I'd like to lock to this face. Come to the axis and lock to this end axis. Come over to this end axis and lock to this cylinder here. Now I've got one more left, so I come back to the parts library. I think I've got the connector left, so come back to the connector and drag in the connector. Hesitate, wait for the back face, grab that plane and lock to this front face. Come down and get the cylinder and lock to this cylinder. Come over to this cylinder and lock to the red cylinder. And so there's the finished assembly. I'll hit escape. Now I'd like to add motion. So I'll come up to rotational motor, and what you usually put the motor on is this crank. So I'm going to identify the crank, and look what it's asking me. Click on an under constrained part to be moved by the motor. So that would be the crank. So I'll select that, and I'd like it to spin around this axis right here. So I'll pick that. Let's just flip the direction. And I'll hit finish. Now my simulate motor is active. Click on simulate motor, just take the defaults and come over to play. Go ahead and save this as a movie if you'd like.